Today we're having a conversation with Miss Mildred Doyle, the grand old lady of East Tennessee education. Miss Doyle's career in public schooling spanned more than 60 years, and for 30 years, between 1947 and 1976, she was Knox County Superintendent of Public Instruction. I don't think it would be laying it on too thick, Miss Doyle, to say that you were one of the most powerful and most popular leaders in East Tennessee education in our era.
I don't know that it's any great feat to have been involved in all of this, although I enjoyed it. My 30 years as superintendent was a wonderful experience for me. I became involved with so many wonderful people. My early days in South Knox County, of course, began way back nearly, well, more than 80 years ago when I was born in 1904. So, you see, I can remember even going to school in the first grade. I remember the classroom where they had this old manila beat-up reading chart up here on the wall, and that's about the only experience that we had in materials to teach reading. I don't know how I learned to read, I guess by listening to the rest of the youngsters, because I was in a two-teacher school. And I was in what we call the little room. And then when you got to the 5th grade, you got into the big room. This was at Moore's School, which is adjacent to our family home on Martin Mill Pike. I was born on Newbert Springs Pike at the time, but we moved to Martin Mill when I was about 7 or 8 years old. So we had, as far as interest in schools, of course, one of 11 children, you know, your parents have to become interested in seeing that you get 11 youngsters to school and fix a lunch in a big basket, and where you go, where you have an hour at lunchtime and you get to play ball and all those kinds of things. Those were my early experiences as far as education is concerned.
I understand, Miss Doyle, that your father, Charter Doyle, was a very important influence on your early life and was really your mentor in politics.
My father, Charter Doyle, who was the great-grandson of the man who came to Knox County in 1800. The place, you know, is the family home place, has been in the family since 1800, and my father, as I said, was very active in civic affairs. He was interested in schools. He was a member of what was then called the county court for 25 years. His father was a member of county court before him for about that length of time, and his grandfather was a member of county court. I guess that's really where I got my interest in what was happening in politics, I'm sure it would be called these days.
Miss Doyle, your early claim to fame seemed to come through sports, basketball and baseball. I understand that you were rough and tough as an athlete.
Well, I don't know how much fame is involved, but I did play a lot of basketball. I played a lot of softball. In fact, I made the team as a freshman in high school, and I played in college. I played then what we called independent basketball and softball, and I think I stopped playing ball in 1945. I was then a supervisor in the Knox County schools getting ready to run for superintendent, and they told me I mustn't play ball, that it wasn't ladylike to play baseball or softball and attempt to be superintendent of schools too.
Yeah, I understand when you first became a teacher that you were, and this was in 1924?
Right, I first started teaching in 1924.
And if we count correctly, that was 61 years ago.
That's exactly right.
I understand that you were accused of being somewhat of a flapper at that time. Is there any truth in that?
That's an interesting thing, yes. I was a classroom teacher for 5 years. And I was teaching at Vestal School. I taught 1 year at Anderson School, which is in Knox County up on Prospect Road, and then I went to Vestal School. And the principal of the school asked for a transfer to another school, and I applied for the principalship. Well, I assume it was a valid PTA at that time, but they got up a petition protesting the fact that I was a flapper and I wasn't settled, and I they really needed a man principal because they were afraid I couldn't handle the 7th and 8th grade youngsters. And they said I was not very serious about the business of living. And as I said, they said she's young and reckless and a flapper. And of course, of all the things I wasn't, it was a flapper. Now, if they'd have said tomboy, they would have been correct.
Yeah, I understand that, and I think this is a quote that they wanted a man of high Christian principles
That's
to
right.
take this job.
That is right.
Do you feel that you suffered overt sex discrimination in your career?
Well, not too much, because I guess I was, when I think back, because of my ball playing days and all, I guess I was pretty aggressive. And I doubt, seriously, after I became principal of the school and actually ended up with wonderful working relationships with this same group that thought I was a flapper and didn't want me to be principal. I had excellent working relationships with those people. And the same was true after I decided I wanted to run for superintendent. Of course, I had many people say, no, that's a man's job, you see. Just like they thought it was a man's job when I wanted to be principal of the school. And I guess that's sex discrimination if you want to make it so. But as I said, I guess being as aggressive as I was, it didn't occur to me at the time that I was being discriminated against.
Yeah, okay. As a young woman, you said that the last thing in the world you wanted to be was an old maid school teacher.
Now, I don't
I'm not going to characterize. I'm not going to
truth.
characterize you as an old maid school teacher, but you did go into education despite that.
Well, and that's an interesting story, because I did say that. I had my sister just older than I was a teacher, and I know I used to say, that's back when I was playing independent basketball. That was before I played softball, and I was very active with the chores around the farm and all that. I enjoyed working, and I said, well, there's one thing I will never be, is an old maid school teacher. I don't think I ever was, really. I said, I want to be a professional athlete. I want to be recognized as an athlete. Of course, there were not many opportunities back then, so when my sister was a teacher, and she had been assigned a teaching position at Anderson School, and got married in the summer. And at that time, the Board of Education didn't let married women teach school when they got married in the middle of prior to the opening of school. So I went to Anderson as a teacher in 1924 and have been at it ever since.
What were your qualifications to be a teacher, Miss
I
Doyle,
doubt
at
if I
that
had
time?
any at all. I doubt well, back in those days, when you graduated from high school, the State Department of Education would grant every high school graduate a 1-year temporary teacher certificate. So I had a temporary teacher certificate for 1 year, and that's the certificate that I used when I did my first year's teaching at Anderson School.
And the next summer you enrolled in summer school at UT.
In order to renew the certificate. And I went to summer school every summer thereafter until I got my master's degree.
Superintendent Doyle, you received your bachelor's degree and your master's degree from the College of Education at UT. How good, bad, or indifferent was the education that you received here?
Well, I had some wonderful experiences with many people on the faculty at that particular time. Of course, frankly, back in those days, when education was, when they were trying to broaden the experiences of youngsters and work with youngsters in a different approach to what had been done prior to that time. And I'd like to say, frankly, some of the education courses were a bit silly.
When you say that many of the education courses you had were silly, is this lacking in substance?
Well, let me say this. I think it was the change from some of the older methods of teaching at that particular time to what was then called progressive education. I think that's the term I want to use. For example, I know in one class, this person with whom I taught they used to play games in the school, and she was a dog, and she would go around smelling of different people so in order to get acquainted with them, you see, that type of approach, which I thought was a bit silly. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe it did some good. Who knows?
Miss Doyle, you were first elected school superintendent in 1946, right after World War II. Would you comment on schooling conditions as they existed at that time?
At the time I became superintendent of schools in 1946, this was right at the end of the wartime, the war period. And schools had deteriorated from the standpoint of physical plants, well, and from the standpoint of personnel, because so many people were involved in the war effort. All building materials, they could hardly be gotten for to repair schools. Or they, and of course, there's so many people were involved in the war effort in other ways. I know when Oak Ridge came on the scene, a lot of teachers left the profession and went to Oak Ridge because of the salary. You see, when I became superintendent, there were two salary schedules. High school teachers were paid more than elementary school teachers. And on the state salary scale, I believe the beginning salary for elementary teachers was about $100 a month. And there was a state supplement, a very small one at that time. I know there were classes on stages behind curtains. I remember one in particular, and this was at Ball Camp School, in a small room down in the basement, a very small window that they called the tater hole. The buildings had just been let go because there was nothing available. And then on top of that, there were so many small schools. Let me give you an example here. I made this report to county court in 1966. This is a 20-year study. At that time, in 1946, there were 8 one-teacher schools. There were 13 two-teacher schools. There were 37 schools with fewer than 8 teachers. There were only 6 supervising principals in the elementary schools, and only 1 elementary school had a clerk. Many of them didn't have telephones. Many of them were still heating with pot-bellied stoves. 50 schools didn't have toilet facility, restrooms. 54 schools didn't have a telephone at that time.
So there really wasn't much difference in the physical plant between those and schools in East Tennessee a half-century before,
That's
as far as
exactly
the
right.
physical plant
That's
was
exactly
concerned.
right. And as I said, it's not due to the lack of interest on the part of the people in administration. It was just the fact that materials were not available. I thought this was interesting, that of the people who were teaching at that time, there were only 32 master's degrees and only 177 bachelor's degrees. 89 teachers only had 3 years college. 196 teachers had only 2 years college. And there were 68 teachers less than 2 years college teaching in the Knox County schools at that time.
And that's the end of World War II.
That's the end of World War II.
In your first election for county school superintendent, a sheriff was hired to guard the ballot boxes. What was that all about?
Well, first, I was elected first by county court. In 1946, I was elected for county court. But in the meantime, one of the members of county court brought a lawsuit saying that the city had a right to participate in what was happening in the county because they were county taxpayers. So that put the election before the people. Well, in 1948, I ran in the Republican primary election. Okay, in counting the votes in that primary election, and incidentally, I ran against a man who had been former superintendent, one of the finest men in the profession at that time, Mr. Morris. He gave me my first job teaching school. I had great respect for him. But some friends and I were when the votes were brought in from the various precincts, we were there, and the votes were called out, and we kept tab. And appeared that I had won the election, but the person who was then chairman of the primary declared the election was over and that my opponent had been elected. Well, we figured that there was some things going on that shouldn't go, so I went around to the sheriff's office, which was just in the old courthouse, and asked him to padlock the door and hold the ballot boxes until a count could be made. So when the count was made, it found that I won by 100 votes.
Do you think that school superintendents ought to be this deeply involved in politics? Do you
No.
see that as a problem?
I do, and I don't think they should be. I think there can be as many political implications in a school system where the superintendent is elected by the board as there is with one elected by the people. But I think, professionally speaking, a superintendent should not have to appear on a partisan ticket and spend $30,000, $20,000, $30,000, or $40,000 in an election to be elected. I think that's not the professional approach to the business of selecting a superintendent. Although I was elected about 7 or 8 straight times, but
You certainly were a successful
well, I was fortunate.
politician.
I was fortunate.
I'm going to take a chance on this. I know that some of the teachers over the years called you Granny. What do you think they meant by that?
I don't know. I know where that came from. I know that was back in my ball playing days, and we were playing a team from Chattanooga. And in place of hitting the ball to center or to right field, as I normally would for a right-handed hitter, I was hitting late and just barely got the ball behind the first baseman, and of course the left fielder was playing in close. And at that time, anyone else could have run it out, but I couldn't. I had slowed down a bit. Well, the first time up I did that, and the second time the same thing. And as I turned to go back to the dugout, some leather-lunged farmer sitting up here in the stands right back and says, "Come on, Granny, you run like a dry spring." So I guess maybe that's where it came from. Well, and I suspect with a lot of young people, now, so many youngsters, we made it a point to employ what we considered good beginning teachers. And maybe at that time, I guess maybe they felt like I was old enough to be their mama, and I really was.
Well, and I wonder if there wasn't something to kind of sense of protecting them and nourishing them and so forth.
Because I see youngsters today, and they say, well, you know, they say, you gave me my first job. Well, I didn't give them a job. They earned the job to begin with.
Going back to this single salary schedule for a moment, I think many feel that salary schedule paying elementary teachers less than secondary teachers was a kind of sexual discrimination in itself, since most of the elementary teachers were women.
That's right.
Was that an issue at all in changing to the single salary schedule?
I don't think so. The only person who publicly, and it could have been, who publicly made a statement about going to a single salary schedule was a vocational ag teacher. And
That was in opposition to it.
In opposition to it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think the idea was that high school teachers were better prepared and smarter than elementary school teachers. I really feel that had something to do with it. And then, of course, you understand that people say, well, she's a woman and her husband has a good job. She doesn't need to be paid as much as someone who's the breadwinner, so-called breadwinner, and all that kind of thing.
And that attitude seems to suggest that teaching is a kind of welfare rather than a profession.
Right. That's right.
Miss Doyle, one of the major issues that gave many county school systems problems was the issue of school consolidation. How tough was it here?
Well, let me say this. We ran, I assume you're talking about consolidating like the one teacher schools.
That's right.
And the two teacher schools. We ran into very little difficulty there. Most of our one teacher schools were the Negro schools back then. And we integrated our schools long before the situation got to the lawsuit stage, and had very good success with it. And we didn't have too much difficulty in closing schools. Now, of course, anytime you close a school or fire a coach, you got troubles. You got to be real careful about those things.
Those are your two major explosive issues as superintendent. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. But anyhow, I really was just kidding. But anyhow, we had no problem there.
Another issue that you just mentioned in passing was the issue of racial desegregation after the Brown decision in 1954, shortly after you became superintendent. What was the reaction to the Brown decision in Knox County as you remember it?
Well, you know, I don't recall any particular problem. You see, we only had about 300 Negro children in the Knox County schools. There were so few children that there was really never a big problem about it. And fortunately, we had some wonderful black teachers. I can recall 5 or 6 right now that probably were as good in the classroom as any teacher we had in the Knox County schools.
We had that terrible outcry over Clinton,
yes,
and national publicity with the White Citizens Council being involved and all of that sort of thing. Do you remember your own staff getting involved in this one way or the other?
We had no problem at all that I can recall.
Yeah.
We had some very, as I said, we had fine, intelligent teachers to begin with. And of course that helped. And then I knew practically every black family that lived in Knox County. You and I live near some of the very finest over in South Knoxville.
Yeah.
And there are people like that. Those who lived out in the county, they were homeowners. We had some fine bus operators. I remember Lyman Bacon as one, and an older gentleman down at Carnes who were just very understanding of the situation.
Where did the black high school students go to school when you first became superintendent?
Austin East.
They went to Austin East. I suppose that was the only black high school in in this immediate area. I think students from Anderson County went over there as well.
And from Sevier County.
Yeah.
And I guess I know there were some from Blount, because they lived just beyond us, across over the mountain there.
So they were able to go to Knox County High School shortly after the decision was made.
Yes. Yeah. And we had a few incidents, but very minor, very minor. The youngsters were all fitted together very well. Yeah. Of course, they all played together, prior to that. Some of the best ball players we had. I remember in some communities, the youngsters played together and thought nothing of it. Yeah. So they fitted in very well when it came to the school situation.
We really appreciate you coming and talking with us. It's been a delight, and we're grateful for the contributions you've made to education in East Tennessee over the years.
Well, it's been my privilege, and I want to thank you for the opportunity of talking about the Knox County schools and my experience, not only as a classroom teacher and a ball player, and as superintendent of the Knox County schools. It was a real privilege for me.
Well, it's been fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.